What a show we have in store for you tonight. It's all about the humor of President Ronald Reagan. How memorable was he when he would get up and speak, and the way he had the audience in his hands because of the way he was able to communicate, the great communicator. And a big part of that was the humor and the way he gave it over. We're going to be joined by none other than a senior advisor to President Ronald Reagan, James Rosebush. He wrote the book True Reagan. He was the chief of staff to Nancy Reagan. He definitely knows a thing or two about President Ronald Reagan, and he'll be joining us. And my co-host is good friend and noted attorney and author and radio host, Richard Solomon. You know what? If it's okay, I'm going to open with a clip from President Ronald Reagan and then turn immediately to James Rosebush.
Your question to President Reagan.
Mr. President, I want to raise an issue that I think has been lurking out there for 2 or 3 weeks and cast it specifically in national security terms. You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
So how was that, James? That moment.
Okay, you notice one thing very important. Mondale was laughing. Okay. And in that clip, which has been seen by 100 million people, that is the convincing part that Mondale himself couldn't resist that. And Reagan, we had conversations about that issue. Obviously, he was aware of it, but he crafted that line himself. That was a part of his genius. But Reagan's humor was what linked him to the American people. Because one of the things that did, because when you are telling the humor the way Reagan does, it can be self-deprecating. It's not to puff yourself up, but it's to make you relatable to other people. Because he talks about, in his jokes, he talks about vulnerability. He talks about how he has a relationship with other people. And, Reagan, in his years in the entertainment industry, he was known as a big talker on the back lots. And he would go, because I had this firsthand. So he would go around Century City, go MGM lot, all this kind of stuff. And he'd just walk around and tell stories to the point where, people were laughing all the time, but they didn't, they had to kind of try to tamp him down. But he grew up loving to tell stories. And the one that really has always gotten me most is when he was asked by George Bush, and George Bush told us at Reagan's funeral, he said, speaking to Ronald Reagan, Bush said, well, how was your meeting today, your one-on-one with Reverend Tutu? And Reagan turns to him and says, so. And I always thought that was the most clever. It's just a lyrical thing. How was your meeting?
Right, Tutu. So. So,
he had to come up with that in the moment. And one of the most interesting, I thought, fun ones was, and you have to remember that Reagan, most of his humor was related to something going on in the world. I mean, you heard the stories about, I hope my doctor is a Republican, that sort of thing. Right. Well, it all had to relate to something going on. And many of his stories about the Soviets and communism, all that sort of thing, they were all done for a purpose. So he used humor to be relatable on issues, never to make fun of anyone, never to make fun. And you might say that his humor was somewhat old-fashioned in a certain regard, but it was perhaps even more enjoyable because it was. So in the very first event that I was responsible for hosting with the president, it was in the old family dining room, and we had invited a bunch of corporate CEOs and foundation CEOs and so forth. I remember sitting next to Don Kendall, who was the longtime CEO of Pepsi. And when the waiters came around and said, "Oh, Mr. Kendall, would you like orange juice or coffee?" he said, "No, Pepsi." And so, but the humor of that was that the White House didn't have any Pepsi, and the waiter had to go down the street, down 17th Street to find a Pepsi. I mean, that guy was really daring to say he wanted Pepsi. But here's how the president started that. He said, and the whole reason for this gathering, by the way, was the program that I was running for the president called Private Sector Initiatives, and it was bringing the private sector in to help the public sector do better, right? And Reagan loved this. So he opens his remarks by this story. He said there was in a community I was aware of, there was every year there was the way they went out fundraising, a United Way or something, and they had this committee and they go out fundraising. But they always avoided, there was an old man, a rich old man who lived in a big mansion, and they were always too intimidated to go and ask him for a contribution. So this one year, the party of about 4 of them, they were going to all these rich people's houses, and so forth. So they decided, okay, we're going to get our courage and we're going to go see this guy. So they said, we would like, they went in and they said, we would like you to make a large donation to the community chest, United Way, whatever it was, right? So he says, I guess you're not aware of the fact that my sister has been in a rehab facility for 45 years. And my son had a tragic accident and he hasn't been able to work. And my wife's mother has been in a nursing home for 25 years. And then he stopped and he said, I never gave them any money, and I'm not going to give you any money. So he was just telling, they all laughed, but it was all making a point that this guy, it was supposed to be a funny story. So, and laughed at that, but the whole idea, of course, was that they were going out to convince people, and this is what Reagan wanted this group to do, was to bring in more resources from the private sector to help what we were doing in government programs. So he used that in a way to kind of begin his remarks. And he was very good at that. And I think also when he came back and he gave that incredibly successful State of the Union address after he was, had gone through coming back from the assassination attempt, and he read that letter from that boy. We always got thousands of letters, that sort of thing. And he read this letter from this boy, 12-year-old boy in New Jersey, and it said, "Mr. President, I hope you get better really fast. Otherwise, you're going to have to be giving your speeches in your pajamas." And of course, that brought down the House as well. But it was just natural for him. And I think this is something, I have to tell you guys, I feel like this is something that one of the reasons I get people stopping me on the street. "Oh, I wasn't even born when Reagan was here, but could you just tell me about Reagan? Oh, I wish I had lived during Reagan. Could you just," these are people, they weren't even alive during Reagan. And they just want to know more about him because he was the example of great leadership, which we're so desperate, the whole world. I'm writing my 4th book now. I don't know if you know this, called The Rise of Politics and the Decline of Leadership. So you have there's such a thirst for leadership in the world today. And a part of being a great leader is being able, of course, to be a communicator, which Reagan was, but to relate to people in a way that they can feel that they trust you. And that is not to make jokes at someone else's expense. It is to show that you're human. Really, it's to show that you're human. And because all of those stories were really basically humor that was, you would say, rather dated, but it related. And another thing I have to share with you. So every morning I would show up at the White House for our senior staff meeting at 7 a.m. Reagan would come down when we finished our meeting, and about, let's say, 8 o'clock, 8:30, go to the Oval Office. Well, there would be a line outside the Oval Office. What was that line for? People stood in line, the staff, to go in and tell him a story. because he wanted to hear a joke. He wanted to start his day by hearing humor. What a great way. I'm sure he had started upstairs, in a prayerful way, but he goes down to the Oval Office, and it became a competition. It was almost as if you were going to a ball game. People were lined up. Oh, I got to tell the president this, this story that I heard or whatever. And you could hear him in the Oval Office roaring with laughter. And, what is that saying, you guys, that humor is the best medicine, right? So I think he felt that as well. But more than anything else, because he loved the American people so much, he wanted them to trust him. But there wasn't anything fake about it. He wanted to show them that they could laugh, they could see things with humor. And heavens knows we need humor today, even much more than the times we had with Reagan, which, by the way, were very, very serious times, obviously, as you know. But today, things, what Reagan said, don't forget this is not a part of the humor story, but if the light of American exceptionalism grows dim, the rest of the world goes into chaos. And that is precisely what is happening at this time. So even in this very dark and challenging time, I think it's important to always remember that there is good going on in every household, in every street, in every church, in every synagogue. There's so much good going on, but we have to hold to that because we see so much chaos going on, right? So Reagan had that, but he knew that humor was a part of the medicine that we really need.
Richard.
Would you say that it was even more exceptional in the sense that President Reagan didn't have the benefits of digital editing, social media, YouTube, followers? He had to do it on the spot, spontaneous, under pressure, which makes it so much harder, but it shows how exceptional he really was.
He had that because he had it in his heart, I think. He didn't need, of course, he had speechwriters, but the speechwriters, these were really, this is very unique because the speechwriters he had knew what was in his heart. So, and he was very involved in writing his speeches, by the way. So he would have a beginning meeting with all the speechwriters, and he would, and in several occasions, I had copies of these and I was marking these things up, not terribly because they were so well done, but he would say, well, this is what I'd like to say. And then they go back and they put it together. And then he edited every single speech. I have copies of speech, but he wrote, because a lot of people say, oh, well, Reagan, he was just a mouthpiece for great speechwriters. No, they would see it the opposite. He inspired the speechwriters. Okay. So, and obviously, he would stop. He didn't. And this is a very important point. And I put something on LinkedIn about the inadvisability of doing, giving a great speech like a speech before the Congress and ad-libbing. Very bad idea. Very bad idea. And you want to make sure that when you're giving a very important and great speech, that you're staying on cadence with that speech, not to just, I think I'll throw in this, or I think I'll throw. No. Reagan had to remember he was a person who was used to having a script, but it never came across as a script, right? So he knew the things that he was going to say now. And I want to say another thing about his humor. It was especially in terms of his international relations, the stories, I think I mentioned this briefly before, were always purposeful. So I think one of the most important little speeches or little jokes he ever told was, about that Russian who went in. Well,
we're going to get there, and we're going to actually play that one. Oh, we got to play
that. Yeah, that is really meaningful because remember, Reagan was very much criticized for calling out the Soviet Union as an evil empire, right? But few people know that after the breakup of the Soviet Union, in conversations with the head of security of the entire city of Moscow, he was quoted, even in the Washington Post, as saying, yes, Reagan called us the evil empire. Well, guess what? We were. And he's a Soviet. He said, yes, we were an evil empire. And by Reagan calling it out, remember, Reagan showed us, always call out evil and name it. When you name the evil, you cut its power. You cut off its power. You name it. You do not hide from saying, this is evil, this is wrong. As much as you're not allowed by certain forces to say that today and to do it, you must do that, because that takes the power away from it. And it shifts the power to the right and to the truth. And this is critically important. And I think it's one of the big problems today, that people are, oh, you're not allowed to say this, you're not allowed to say that, especially like the shooting we had this week. I mean, that just hit me to the core. That was just unbelievable. And not that it happens a lot, unfortunately, but I that just affected me so much. And I think you must have the power and the confidence to know the difference between truth and error, right and wrong. If you lose that distinction, you don't have a culture anymore. So anyway, Reagan would use humor often to denigrate the wrong. And he did that in his, which you're going to show that clip, but he did that in belittling Soviet communism. But he did it in a way that after he said that, you're like, oh, yes, he's making a point, but he's making a point through humor.
It was such a clever way, such a clever way. I'm joined by co-host Richard Solomon, and we're having an incredible conversation with James Rosebush. He wrote the book True Reagan. He is a senior advisor to President Ronald Reagan and chief of staff to Nancy Reagan. What an incredible conversation.
I spoke of the difference between our two countries. I try to follow the humor of the Russian people. We don't hear much about the Russian people. We hear about the Russian leaders. But you can learn a lot because they do have a sense of humor, and you can learn from the jokes they're telling. And one of the most recent jokes I found kind of, personally interesting. Maybe you might tell you something about their country. The joke they tell is that an American and a Russian were arguing about the differences between our two countries. And the American said, look, in my country, I can walk into the Oval Office, I can hit the desk with my fist and say, President Reagan, I don't like the way you're governing the United States. And the Russian said, I can do that. The American said, what? He says, I can walk into the Kremlin, into Brezhnev's office, I can pound Brezhnev's desk, and I can say, Mr. President, I don't like the way Ronald Reagan is governing the United States.
Okay, so I'm here with co-host Richard Solomon, but let's hand it over to James Rosebush. He referenced this famous speech in the first part of tonight's show. Yes, point out the strengths, the intelligence, the brilliance about how he wanted to drive home a point through humor.
And make it relatable to what people could really, of course, people, they had to laugh at that, but it made its point, right? So Reagan was a very purposeful speaker. And remember, he took his values seriously, but he never took himself too seriously. He was devoted to his beliefs, but he had no ego. And it's very, people will say to me, because I coach speakers as well, as you know, and I have my book, Winning Your Audience, and I do talk about this in it. People are like, oh, I could never tell a joke. Or they say, or all they do is tell jokes, and it doesn't go over. I think it's extremely important, and I try to do this with people who are public speakers or they want to be a public speaker. Basically, stay away from joke telling. Basically, stay away, because you have to be very good at it. And to be good at it, you have to be, if you take the example of Reagan, as I started to say, he's the only person in my entire lifetime that I've ever known who had a complete zero ego. He had no ego at all. And very often, I think, even people that are paid to be humorous, late night TV or Saturday Night Live, shows, and we don't have that many shows anymore that are humorous. I mean, we had In the old days, we have people who were incredibly talented, like Lucille Ball, and and we had the Golden Girls. Because I love to laugh, so I try to laugh before I go to sleep at night. So I watch some of these reruns. But you have to be a person. Reagan had zero ego, and because he didn't remember, this was a part of his great genius. He didn't care what you thought of him. Now, how many of us can say that? I mean, I certainly can't. I want people to like me. Reagan, he was completely, it's not self-satisfied, but he had no need. So he left the White House, the exact same person who walked in the White House 8 years before that. Now, how often can you say that? Thatcher herself, another great leader and a partner of Ronald Reagan, she thought she started out in a humble way. Many times I was with her and I saw that. And then she goes on and she believed in herself too much. And she left office in a degraded way because she had an ego. Ronald Reagan, he had no sense that he was important. His ideas were important. And that is why people could listen to his humor and enjoy it. And I believe that if you are a person the rare person who doesn't have an ego, and you can share humor in a way that you're doing it in a way that is relatable to other people, but not making fun of them, then it can work. But generally, I say stay away from it, because I wouldn't call myself another Ronald Reagan, that's for sure. So I think, staying away from it is probably a good idea.
Richard?
Well, humor can't be forced and it can't be rehearsed. And I also think that he really used the whole story mechanism to weave the humor in. Because it wasn't necessarily that he told jokes so much as he told, stories with humorous moments. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yes. And I was just going, and you make excellent points, Richard. I wanted to say, and this is important in the sense that when he was in the hospital after the assassination, after he was shot, he was much closer to death than the public knew. And I'll tell you a story about that in a minute. But you remember he famously said, when he saw his wife after he had been wheeled into the operating room, "Oh, honey, I forgot to duck." You remember that? And then I hope the guy who's operating on me is a Republican. Well, that is an incredible skill and ability of Reagan. He knew he had to do something. He had to protect the people he loved. That was the American people. And he wanted to protect them from the fear that they were losing their president and that they could be threatened by, losing someone that they voted for. And it wasn't that he was trying to pump up or secure his own popularity, anything like that. He felt, because he loved the American people so much, he didn't want them to feel like, well, this is a terrible crisis. I think that's one of the most dramatic healings in the way that I've ever heard. And it's so inspiring for the rest of us. But I think the way he also treated that situation with humor was because of his love for his audience.
In furtherance of that, talking about sort of dramatics, I think one thing that he did that was very important that eased the tension was, I remember they had a shot of his hospital window. And I think he was like in a robe, and he just waved to everybody to show that he was okay. And I think that just silent communication, I'm okay, we're okay, we're going to be okay. I think that was a very important message that, just had to be said or not said, but effectuated. And I thought that was incredibly important. I remember that to this day.
There was another time that he had to be in the hospital and stayed overnight, and we didn't know that he was going to have to stay overnight. And so he said to me, "Jim, I might have told this story before on one of your wonderful shows, but he said, Jim, would you mind going back to the White House and getting a change of clothes for me to wear tomorrow?" leaving the hospital the next day, and I said, oh, of course I will. Usually there'd be like a military steward there or something doing that. I didn't care. I loved I'd do anything for him. And so I got in the White House car and I went back to the White House and went upstairs. And I had one of the most stunning moments. When I had been, it was part of my job, I was in the family quarters quite a bit, but I'd never really gone into his closet. And so when I opened the closet, they were like cupboards, and there was like one blue suit, one brown suit, one black pair of shoes. And I thought, the world thinks, Ronald Reagan, this rich guy, President of the United States, blah, 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 blah. No. He was not a person who needed a lot of material accoutrements. Another time we were going to on a state visit all around, I don't know, a number of countries. And Nancy Reagan, so at night they'd take, if we were leaving in the middle of the night or early morning on Air Force One, they would take all of our stuff out to Air Force One and put it in the belly, right? So we had racks, they had racks of clothes. So there was Nancy Reagan, the first lady, she had to have a lot of clothes, right? I said, Mr. President, you need to pack. You need to pack. And he looked at me. He says, oh, Jim, I have. Look, like that. And there was like one suit bag. And I'm like, oh, my gosh. But, he didn't take himself that seriously. I mean, ego-wise. He took the issues of the world and his beliefs, he took very seriously. But he didn't take himself so seriously that people were, felt separated from him. And that's why he got along so well with his opponents. He would laugh and get together with his opponents on Capitol Hill. He says, you remember the picture of his looking at his watch, after 5 o'clock, we're friends. And I'll tell you, in the name of humor too, I remember one time going to a bar in Dorchester, Massachusetts. Oh, now you talk about blue, that's a navy blue section of town, right? And did they love Reagan? Oh my, and they're all big Democrats, all union people, everything. Oh my gosh, they couldn't, let me get my arms around this. Oh my gosh, unbelievable. Okay, that's why when he ran in 84, that landslide, because he had a huge number of Democrats voting for him. When we went to Ireland, right, we went into where in his town where, his family came from. We went into pubs there. Oh my gosh, they just, I could see, it wasn't just politicians, it was the everyman and woman. They saw Reagan as someone they could relate to. And this is so important, I think, in leadership, that you are, and not in a fake way, but you feel, and the people that you're leading feel you're a part of them. You're not elevated above them, or you're not distant from them. Now, does that mean, getting in a car and going out to, Walmart? No, not necessarily. But it's more of a spiritual thing. It's more of how you feel in your heart about those people.
We're speaking with none other than James Rosebush, a senior advisor. He was a senior advisor to President Ronald Reagan, knew him well, and a chief of staff to Nancy Reagan. I'm joined by Richard Solomon as a co-host. To find out more information about James Rosebush, he in particular coaches many CEOs out there on public speaking, on confidence. You can find out more information by going to growthstrategy.us. Again, that's growthstrategy.us.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, distinguished members of the Congress, honored guests, and fellow citizens. Today marks my first State of the Union address to you, a constitutional duty as old as our republic itself. President Washington began this tradition in 1790 after reminding the nation that the destiny of self-government and the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty is finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. For our friends in the press who place a high premium on accuracy, let me say, I did not actually hear George Washington say that.
He used that line several times because there was I don't know if you know this, but in the state dining room, there was a famous quip that John F. Kennedy gave when he was president. On the mantelpiece there is a saying that I think it had to do with when Jefferson dined. There were never, and so Kennedy was saying, well, there was never been such, he was giving a dinner, by the way, for the Nobel Peace Prize, all the winners of the Nobel Peace Prize. And he said, never since Jefferson dined here has there been so much intelligence when he dined alone. That was right. So there were all these Nobel Prize winners, and Kennedy says, well, never since Jefferson dined alone has there been so much intelligence. Of course, that wouldn't be a very popular thing to say today, but Jefferson was a very, very intelligent person, obviously, in a lot of fields. As a matter of fact, I, along with the Jefferson Foundation, created the first International Diplomacy Award, which was given to Margaret Thatcher. Wow. And we were very honored to be at dinner that night in Monticello. No electricity, it was all by candlelight. And Thatcher was obviously receiving this award, and she was the recipient of it. And I must say, contrary to the way JFK handled it and the way Reagan, by the way, repeated that story, which he got a lot of reaction to, Thatcher spent about a half hour comparing herself to Thomas Jefferson. And I thought, well, what a different kind of approach. You might say this is the opposite of the kind of humor people would want to hear, because she wasn't being humorous about it. She really felt that she was, I think it'd be very dangerous to go into any kind of setting and compare yourself to someone who'd been historically admired for their achievements. So Reagan gave his humor delivered his humor with a lot of humility. And I have to say, let's add to this a little bit, that one of the ways that Nancy Reagan regained her position as one of the most popular first ladies, as you may think about. Now, this is going on a little bit a tangent for you, but is Nancy Reagan's humor. So you may remember that the way she regained her position, one of the ways was that she dressed up in you might say, like a street person's clothes, ragged with a broom and, all this kind of stuff. And she came out and sang this song, Secondhand Rose, and it was rewritten to fit a message. Basically, the press corps had really been very rough on her about her fancy clothes and all this kind of stuff. And so she came out and used humor to really win the day. So she came out, we had practiced this song upstairs and played the piano for it. She was sing, and she really worked hard on it. And the staff brought in old clothes and old shoes and everything like that. And she had the temerity and the wherewithal to go in front of, I'm talking about hundreds and hundreds of people at this very important dinner. And she really won the day. She really won them over because they saw, and this is really important, they saw that she could view herself with humor. And if you take yourself too seriously and you don't use humor, it doesn't work. And I will tell you that was it wasn't the only thing she did, because she worked hard to turn her public standing around, her public opinion rating, and got it up. But this was definitely one of the key times, and it was all due to her willingness to show self-deprecation through humor. And people were roaring. I mean, they were just roaring. They were on the floor laughing. And the next day, it was like, well, we're seeing a new Nancy Reagan. She's willing to be humorous and make her the object of the humor.
I'm joined by co-host Richard Solomon. Richard. And of course, we're speaking with James Rosebush, the former senior advisor to President Ronald Reagan and chief of staff to Nancy Reagan. Richard.
I two things. The one thing I always notice in watching clips of President Reagan is that he smiled. And I always tell people who do public speaking, smile. And I even tell people, like, you could hear the smile even on radio, right? I always tell people, sit up, project, smile, because you hear that. And the other thing that was very distinguishable about President Reagan was the quality of his voice. He had this very soothing voice. And when you throw in the smile and his cadence and his steadiness, it's a great speaking package. Could you maybe, for the people out there who are potential speakers or people who are in business and want to really bring a better communication style, could you kind of show the lessons of President Reagan on those particular components?
Yeah, Richard, those are excellent points. And I'll tell you why it works. What you just said is because it's physical. When a couple of these things are physical, when you actually smile, you are you're lifting your cheeks actually, and that is creating a different kind of tone. And I do this with the leaders that I coach. When you smile, it lifts your cheeks and it brings diversity into the tones that you actually speak with, which makes it much more listenable to people, as you said, they can't even see you. The other thing is, I had a CEO of a company, and he had as a man, he had an extremely high-pitched voice, and he was very embarrassed about it. He didn't want to speak in public. And this is an example in contrast to Reagan's. And he said, he was very embarrassed. And I said, well, you can change the tone of your voice. No, I've had this since I was a kid. I don't know, blah, blah, blah. I said, watch me. So I said, I took a ball. There was and I had a basketball, and I pushed him against a wall. And I said, now I want you to start speaking. And I pushed that ball into his stomach, and his voice tone went down like an octave. And he said, how could this be happening? I said, because you're pushing warm air up from your belly, and you're not doing your face voice. You're doing the sound coming up with warm air coming up from your stomach. And so Reagan had this ability. First of all, he was not, excitable or mercurial. He was very steady in his personality because of what he believed in. So his voice, he had a very good chest or stomach voice. And that was natural to him because, of course, he had that on screen. But he told me the very first time that he began to believe in himself as a great speaker, and it was in college, and it was in this room they called the student center, where it didn't look like a student center then. I've spoken there myself, and he was a part of a movement to get the president of the college fired, if you can believe it. Doesn't seem like it fit with Ronald Reagan, right? But he was the leader of this whole movement. And he said, for the first time, I learned the power of oratory. Because every time he would say something in support of, these are the reasons why we have to get rid of this gentleman or whatever, they would cheer and they would cheer. And he saw the importance of oratory. And he, for the first time, that is where he gained his confidence in his voice. And you're absolutely right, Richard. I mean, you could listen to Ronald Reagan for hours. And most other people, you can't listen to them for hours. But the other aspect of Reagan speaking there was that he was also reasoning with you. So let's say I was sitting in the front row where the White House staff was in several of those speeches in London. in Guildhall, in Whitehall, all these places where he was speaking and around the world. In Lisbon, where they released 100 white doves while he was speaking. And he treated that with humor. Okay, now just think about that. So we're sitting in, basically, I forget what it's called, but in the huge government hall in the Capitol in Lisbon. And there were people who were protesting. And so they let all these white pigeons or doves go. And this massive room was filled with all these birds. And Reagan, believe it or not, he turned that around through humor. And it was something about, well, I'm sure even the birds are, would believe what we're trying to achieve, or, he turned it into a way that, well, the intent was to destroy his message or to disturb it or to make a big national story out of it. He turned it right around like that. Now that, and I'm glad that I've thought of that example, because it is very often how you disarm a very fiery and challenging situation where people are opposing you. It's not to make fun of them, but it is to turn it around through some kind of, and you got it. I mean, to be able to do that takes a lot of skill. And, they always say about Reagan, oh, as I said before, he's scripted or whatever. Well, there was no script there, I can tell you that, because I was sitting right there and none of us knew that the people who were opposed to what Reagan was saying, these protesters, were going to let all of these 100,000, maybe it was 1,000 birds just completely flying all around this place.
We have exactly 2 minutes left to the show. To find out more information and to get in touch with James Rosebush, growthstrategy.us, growthstrategy.us. He is a great public speaker, as you could hear. He was listening by the radio. And, of course, this will be up on YouTube. This will become a very popular segment in very short order. Richard, we have 2 minutes left.
I was just going to say, if you notice, one of the themes is that President Reagan used humor to break tension, the tense moments during the debate, during critical moments. It was just to break the tension, just to ease the battlefield, so to speak.
He did. And I think that also, even those protesters, I'm sure that they were actually laughing along with him. That's the thing to do with your enemies, You bring them in through humor and letting them know that they haven't hurt you.
Wow, this wraps up an incredible edition of Mind Your Business. We were treated to James Rosebush, a senior advisor to President Ronald Reagan and chief of staff to Nancy Reagan, First Lady Nancy Reagan. Again, James leads a international consulting firm, Growth Strategy. You can find out more information. Visit growthstrategy.us. He is a consultant for many leaders and CEOs out there. To find out more information, growthstrategy.us. This wraps up an incredible edition about Reagan's humor. Wow. Tune in again next Sunday night for another great edition of Mind Your Business right here on 710 WOR, the voice of New York. Have a successful week. Thank you for watching, and make sure to subscribe to this channel and be notified every single time a new video goes live. Don't miss out on any of the weekly interviews that I have with top business leaders, sometimes Fortune 500 executives. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications.